Noble and heroic warriors, the symbol of virtue and all that is good in the world, defenders of faith and dealers of justice. Paladins are of a special breed. They hold true to their ideals and values at all times, while serving the cause that they have devoted their lives to. While a paladin can simply be boiled down to being a holy warrior, there's just so much more to it that makes it such an appealing and interesting class in Dungeons & Dragons from both a role-playing and a mechanical perspective. This is the history of the Paladin. The Paladin would not make its first appearance in Dungeons & Dragons until the AD&D days, missing out on the inclusion in the original game. And interestingly, even when it was added to the game, it was not a class of its own, but rather a subclass to the fighter. Advanced Dungeons & Dragons had a total of 5 classes: the Cleric, Fighter, Magic User, Thief, and Monk, and one of the additions that AD&D brought to the game over the original was the inclusion of subclasses. Interestingly, many of the AD&D subclasses would actually become classes in their own right in the future, including the Druid, Ranger, and Paladin. Like other classes and subclasses of the time, the Paladin had specific conditions that had to be met prior to being able to be played. Firstly, the character must be human. No other race option was allowed. Secondly, it had to meet certain ability score requirements, which were a strength of 12, intelligence of 9, wisdom of 13, constitution of 9, and a charisma of 17. While these are some reasonably high ability score requirements, and a race selection that was limited to exactly 1, they were not actually the most stringent of requirements for the Paladin. Unlike other classes of the time, the Paladin had associated with it an alignment restriction. A Paladin must be lawful good. In addition, if a Paladin ever performs an act that is considered chaotic, they must seek out a powerful lawful good cleric of at least 7th level, confess their sins, and perform the required penance. And if they ever knowingly or willingly perform an evil act, there is no penance. They immediately and irrevocably lose their status as a Paladin, losing all benefits of the subclass, and are forever reverted to a fighter. It's amazing to think that alignment, something that many people consider in modern D&D to be a relic of the past and irrelevant to the game, was once so crucial and fundamental to the functionality of an entire class. I will say though that while I can certainly see some room for ambiguity and how a spiteful dungeon master could easily ruin a player's day with this mechanic, I think it creates such an interesting and unique balance of flavor and mechanic that we just don't really have in the modern game. So then, with so many stringent requirements just to be able to become a Paladin, the obvious question then becomes, what did you get from it? And honestly, the answer is quite a bit. Paladins in AD&D were able to detect evil up to 60 feet away, add +2 to all saving throw rolls, have immunity to all forms of disease, lay on hands which granted 2 hit points per Paladin level, but could only be used once per day. They were also able to cure any disease once per week per 5 Paladin levels, constantly have the effect of the protection from evil spell as an aura active within 1 foot. Additionally, at 3rd level, a Paladin would gain the 1st level cleric's ability to turn undead or devils, and they remain effectively 2 levels behind. At 4th level, gaining the effect from a 2nd level cleric, and so forth. At 4th level, a Paladin can call for their warhorse, but they can only do this once every 10 years, so if something should happen to that horse, they cannot get another one until that time has expired. Furthermore, if a Paladin has a holy sword, obtainable through some quest or even in their backstory, it radiates the effect of the Dispel magic spell within 1 foot of the sword when drawn, and is cast at the same level as the Paladin character. Finally, starting from 9th level, a Paladin gains the ability to cast cleric spells, though they can never use spell scrolls, except for those already usable by a fighter. Once the characters manage to exceed all the requirements just to become a Paladin, and has gained all of these benefits, there are still a number of other restrictions imposed on the class which the character must adhere to as well. They may never exceed 10 magic items, including 1 set of armor, 1 shield, 4 weapons, and 4 other magic items. They may not retain any wealth and may only keep enough to support themselves, their men-at-arms, and to construct and maintain a small castle. They must immediately also pay a 10% tithe on all earnings to a charitable religious institution. They may only have lawful good henchmen, and can also only associate with groups of non-evil neutrals on a one-off basis, and even then, only if it will further their cause. It's pretty clear that the original Paladin class is very different from not only modern classes in D&D, but also the classes of its own time. With so many restrictions in place, it certainly made playing the character a difficult endeavor that required some significant commitment from the player and their party. I genuinely can see the appeal of playing a class in this way, and in many ways, I kind of wish we had similar things in the game today, but I fully understand why we don't. The team has taken a very different approach to design and classes, and I can't really fault them for that either. There are actually shockingly few differences between the Paladins of 1st and 2nd edition, in many cases even being word-for-word copies of each other. That said, there are new things that are worth mentioning. The Paladin is still a subclass in 2nd edition, but this time to the Warrior main class, interestingly joining the Fighter and Ranger in rounding out the subclass options. The Intelligence requirement has been dropped, though the other 4 ability score requirements remain intact, and Human is still the only race option allowed for a Paladin. All of the same conditions which would force a Paladin to lose their status are also still intact, though this time they have addressed some of the ambiguity present in 1st edition. 2nd edition explicitly notes that should a Paladin perform an evil act while enchanted or controlled by magic, they still lose their Paladin status. However, it is only temporary and lasts only until they can atone for their deed. While no specifics are provided, it is suggested that this atonement is likely to require the completion of some dangerous quest or important mission to prove their worth and assuage their guilt. It should be noted that while a character has lost their status as a Paladin, they function as a fighter and do not gain any experience until they restore their status. Many of the benefits of being a Paladin are also identical to the 1st edition counterpart, with a few small exceptions. 2nd edition now specifies that certain magical afflictions such as lycanthropy and mummy rot are not diseases, and as such a Paladin would not be immune to them, and the same applies to their ability to cure diseases of others. The 10-foot aura surrounding the Paladin now also provides a -1 to attack rolls for summoned and evil creatures. Their ability to call in their warhorse has been clarified to state that the horse doesn't simply just appear, but typically requires a quest of some form. The 10-year waiting period has also been removed, suggesting that they can claim another warhorse should they complete the requisite quest if their first were to die or to be set free. Paladins still need to wait until 9th level to cast spells, this time of the Priest class, which was the main class of the Cleric at the time. Additionally, those spells must be of the Combat, Divination, Healing, or Protective spheres, which is something I will be discussing in the Cleric video. While the version of the Paladin I will be outlining is from D&D 3.5, I will say 3rd edition interchangeably. As seems to be the common trend, 3rd edition marks the beginning of a drastic shift for most classes, and the Paladin is no exception, which now, for the first time, is a class in its own right. Gone are the ability score requirements seen in previous editions, though a Paladin would still need a wisdom score of at least 11 to be able to cast spells. Humans are also no longer the only race option. While it is possible for any race to be a Paladin in 3rd edition, it is heavily suggested that humans, half-elves, dwarves, and even elves to some extent are the much more common choices. However, despite this, a Paladin must still be lawful good, and any deviation in alignment can still result in losing that status. However, as of 3rd edition, this loss is no longer irrevocable, though they do cease all character progression during this time. Provided the character is able to atone for their misdeed, they will be able to restore their paladinhood. This marks a fairly dramatic change to the class that significantly eases up on the versions of the past. Paladins in 3.5 always have an Aura of Good feature active, which functions as the Detect Good spell, which is effectively cast at the character's level. They are also able to cast Detect Evil at will. 3rd edition marks the first time that we would see the precursor to the beloved modern Smite feature, Smite Evil. Smite Evil, while similar, works very differently to its modern iteration. Firstly, it can only be used against evil creatures. Secondly, it can initially only be used once per day, increasing by 1 for every 5 levels before maxing out at 5 uses per day at 20th level. When a character uses Smite Evil, they can add their Charisma modifier to the attack roll, and then simply add 1 extra point of damage per paladin level. Certainly far less dramatic than the version that we have today, but 3rd edition was very different. Divine Grace granted a paladin a bonus to all saving throws equal to their Charisma modifier, and Lay on Hands receives its first major reworking. It can now restore hit points equal to a character's paladin level multiplied by their Charisma modifier, and can also be used to deal damage to undead creatures. At 3rd level, they gain the Divine Health feature, which grants immunity to all diseases, and this time, in contrast to 2nd edition, specifically includes immunity to magical diseases such as lycanthropy and mummy rot. The ability to call a mount, which has differed slightly over the editions, changes again, and this time, once again, in stark contrast to 2nd edition, explicitly states that the mount is magically summoned from the celestial realms and lasts for just 2 hours. The character is able to call upon their mount once per day and dismiss it as a free action as well. An interesting caveat to this is that if the mount should be killed, the Paladin cannot call another one for 30 days, or until they gain a Paladin level, and during that period, the character has a -1 to all weapon attack and damage rolls. One final interesting note about Paladins in 3rd edition is that, while they may multiclass, if a Paladin takes a level in another class, they may never again take a level in Paladin. 3rd edition fundamentally changed the class to make it easier to play and easier to be in a party, but still while maintaining many of the interesting quirks and restrictions that had become a staple of the class up until that point. It presents a very nice change of pace compared to many of the other classes in the game, and I still appreciate its uniqueness in that respect. 4th edition, as usual, takes such a dramatically different approach to the game that it's next to impossible to compare, so instead I'll just mention a few of the highlights. For the first time, a Paladin does not have an alignment requirement. Instead, a character chooses their alignment and corresponding deity. Additionally, a Paladin can also never lose that status. They will forever remain a Paladin regardless of the course of action that they take, though they may be punished by other members of their faith. Channel Divinity makes its first appearance and is surprisingly similar to its modern variant. Smite exists, but not in the way that you might be thinking. In fact, by my count, there are now 20 different encounter prayers that feature the name Smite in it. I pity any 4th edition Paladin player that had to remember the differences. All of this brings us to the smiting powerhouse that is the 5th edition Paladin. Like most classes in 5th edition, this iteration of the Paladin took what used to be a requirement to play the class and changed it into supporting flavor that could help influence the decisions that a player would make. The detect good or evil features of the past have been condensed into the new Divine Sense feature, which allows a character to detect any celestial, fiend, or undead creature within 60 feet, in addition to the location of any item within the same radius that has been consecrated or desecrated. Lay on Hands is still here, and has been updated and streamlined to also incorporate the ability to cure disease. The feature now heals hit points equal to 5 times the Paladin's level, and a character can expend 5 hit points from that pool to cure any disease, though it makes no mention of lycanthropy or mummy rot. While Paladins do have the ability to cast spells up to 5th level, they often tend to forgo that option, instead choosing to use their 2nd level feature, Divine Smite. Divine Smite allows a character, when they hit any creature with a melee attack, to expend a spell slot to deal radiant damage to that target. The damage is equal to 2d8 for a 1st level slot, plus 1d8 for each spell level higher than 1st. Additionally, the damage is also increased by another 1d8 if the creature affected is a fiend or undead. It's pretty easy to see why Paladins in 5th edition have become famous for their incredible burst damage. Paladins have a number of subclasses available to them, referred to as oaths, which encompass the various paths of devotion that the class might undergo. These oaths continue the trend for 3rd edition, which is to say that they no longer require any sort of religious affiliation. The various auras have returned to the class, which grants them and their allies bonuses such as increased modifiers on saving throws or immunity to fear, just to name a few. The 5th edition Paladin has certainly come a long way from its 1st edition counterpart, though it still amazingly retains much of the same flavor and even the abilities, albeit modified versions of them. The modern Paladin is unquestionably easier to play, if for no other reason than forgoing the lawful good requirement, though the Oathbreaker Paladin inclusion is rather interesting. Overall, I think the changes and the growth that the class has seen has been a consistent improvement over time. While I can understand the appeal and the intricacy of playing a Paladin from 1st edition, newer versions have certainly improved the usability and the accessibility of this iconic class. If you enjoyed this video, consider checking out some of my other class histories or any of the other content that I've made. Also, consider subscribing as it dramatically helps other people find my content. But otherwise, take care.